Hello, hello. All right, so I got this message that I am really excited to share today. And I am hoping you will enjoy it as much as I enjoyed studying it. So, we're going to be talking about the wilderness. And um, for a lot of us, we've kind of heard about, seasons of wilderness. People would say, like, hey, I'm kind of in this wilderness journey or this wilderness season, or I just came out of a wilderness season, or I feel like I'm entering a wilderness season, or something like that, right? I think we kind of generalize that, right? And so it makes it seem like every wilderness season is basically the same. Every wilderness season is basically the same. And so I was studying this wilderness season, right? Because I mean I've done that too, right? I've said, like, hey, I feel like I was in a wilderness period or a wilderness season. And so it kind of makes it seem like every time I would go through something, it's kind of the same wilderness period, or it's supposed to do the same thing, or it's supposed to feel like the same thing, um, or it's supposed to mean the same thing. But as I was studying this, I learned something very interesting. I learned something really interesting, right? So we know that there are different people that kind of went through a wilderness period as we go and we read our Bible. Um, and when we look at the wilderness, this is a time frame where um, it's, you're kind of in this barren place, a dry place, nothing's happening. Um, it is, this feeling of being pulled from one place, driven into this barren or dry place where you are, as we would describe it, as we're talking about it spiritually, that you're kind of spending more time with God to prepare to come out into more of a fruitful, hopefully fruitful season, right? So, in essence, your wilderness period is your time of being set apart. Your wilderness season is a time of being set apart. Now, as I already mentioned, being in the wilderness is, the wilderness is a dry or barren place, right? And it's a place where we define it as, like I said, a land without water. It's a wasteland. We would normally define it as an area where, animals kind of graze, but it's not really used for farming. It's not used for farming or living. It's not a place where you live. Which means, because there's nothing out there for us to live on. So if it's nothing for us to live on, but yet we're being set apart, that means whatever we're supposed to be doing out here, that in some form or fashion we're supposed to be connected to God to understand how to live with God. So we're supposed to be getting something from Him to help us to learn how to live. So what I want to do today is kind of take us through different experiences in the wilderness, And we're going to look at 6 different experiences in the wilderness. And we're going to take it from the beginning to the end, right? We're going to look at Moses, Israel, the people of Israel, Moses, the people of Israel, Elijah, David, Jesus, and the Apostle Paul. Moses, the people of Israel, Elijah, David, Jesus, and the Apostle Paul. And we're going to do that in that order. And it's important that we actually follow them in that order so that we can understand what God is showing us and teaching us through the wilderness periods. All right. And like I said, hopefully you enjoy this as much as I have. Now, we're probably going to do this in 2 parts, so we'll see how we get through this today. All right. So we're just going to dive right into this just because there is so much to cover. There is so much to cover. All right, so let's take a look at, let's take a look at Moses. Let's take a look at Moses. When we look at Moses and we start taking a look at Exodus, Exodus 2, the pivotal moment in Exodus 2 is where Moses spends his time in the wilderness, and why he's sent out to the wilderness, right? So we know Moses spends about 40 years in the wilderness, and he spends 40 years in the wilderness before God calls him to use him as the deliverer or the leader to lead the people of Israelite through their period in the wilderness. All right. Now, the way this happens for Moses is this. Moses is born a Hebrew. Moses is born a Hebrew. He's actually his father's a Levite, which is a priest, right? But he's raised a prince in Pharaoh's home. He's raised a prince in Pharaoh's home. And so the thing about Moses is that, God is going to use him to lead his people, but Moses has to learn how to lead God's people. He has to learn how to lead God's people. Well, as we read Exodus 2, we see that one day Moses, when he becomes a man, he walks outside of Pharaoh's home and he basically sees the word says his brethren, right? Which means his people. Moses sees his people who are enslaved, and they are being beaten, right, by the Egyptians. And it doesn't sit well with him. And so he basically strikes the Egyptian, he kills him, and buries the body. The second day he goes out, and I'm kind of running through it because, like I said, we have a lot to cover. The second day he goes out and he sees two Hebrew men in a quarrel, and they're in this quarrel, and they also are hitting each other. And so Moses steps in, and he basically tells them, like, hey, like, why would you do that, right? Why are you hitting each other? Because what's happening is, what Moses is really seeing, Moses is seeing these Hebrew people treat each other the same way that they have been accustomed to being treated by the Egyptians. They've been accustomed to being treated with disregard. They've been accustomed to being treated as they are less than. They're accustomed to being treated with lack of self-worth and not valuing one another. So therefore, if they're in this quarrel, they're literally dealing with each other the same way the Egyptians would deal with them. And that is through violence, right? So they are literally beating on each other. And so Moses says something to them about it. But what they do is they turn around to Moses, and they are now ganging up on Moses. And so they basically judge Moses and say, well, who are you to judge us? And I'm paraphrasing, right? Do the Shawanda version. Who are you to judge us when we basically saw you kill that Egyptian yesterday, right? And so Moses is now like, well, you're making it known what I did. And if you're making it known what I did, then now Pharaoh's going to kill me. And so now I'm not safe either, right? So that's kind of what's happening. And so it's a challenge, because when we look at how Moses is going to spend his time in the wilderness, right? Moses spends his time in the wilderness to learn how to be a shepherd. It's interesting because in that moment back in Egypt, when he encountered the Egyptian, he basically encountered him as a shepherd, because as a shepherd who has to protect his sheep, he basically went after the Egyptian as if the Egyptian is a wolf after the sheep. Because a shepherd, a shepherd is responsible for protecting, right? And providing for, and leading and guiding their flock, their sheep. And that's basically what kind of the position that Moses was taking, right? So those are the characteristics of a shepherd, right? A shepherd shows great concern for his sheep. A shepherd provides nourishment and rest. He guides and leads, and he shows concern for the safety of each of the sheep. Now, what he did, this was contrary again to how he saw his people live. What he was doing was contrary to how he saw his people live, which they were living in slavery, captivity, bondage, under Pharaoh. And that's why this moment is so pivotal, because it's kind of a it's kind of like a little bit of an insight into like how Moses would be used in the future when God would like raise him up to come back and be a deliverer. So we kind of get like a little bit of a taste, or Moses gets a little bit of a taste of like what his future is going to be, interestingly enough. Nonetheless, Moses flees after he is now exposed by the men, right? So Moses is exposed, Moses flees, and so he goes out and he spends time in the wilderness. But when he spends time in the wilderness, he actually winds up having this encounter, and winds up being taken in by the priest of Midian. So it's interesting that he spends time in the home of a priest, that he was born to a priest, raised as a prince, and then now is back in the home of a priest. And when he is now in the home of this priest, he is now spending time out in the wilderness for 40 years as a shepherd. 40 years as a shepherd in the wilderness. 40 years as a shepherd in the wilderness, which is quite interesting. So it is after he spends this 40 years in the wilderness learning to be a shepherd. And remember I mentioned the characteristics of a shepherd, right? The shepherd is the one who shows great concerns for sheep, provides nourishment and rest, guiding and leading them, concern for the safety of each of them. So he is trained to be a shepherd before God actually brings him back to lead his people. And so when Moses is actually wind up leading the people in the wilderness, he is in fact shepherding God's people, shepherding his people during the time frame that they are in the wilderness. So Moses' time in the wilderness is used as a training ground. It's used as a training ground. So this is the training of a leader, the training of the shepherd, the training for his call, the training for how God is going to use him in the future. So as I mentioned, as I started this, that we're going to look at how the seasons of wilderness, and how every time that we spend in the wilderness is not always the same, right? So we want to look at specifically like what that looks like for each and every one of us. And we already see here that Moses, when he went into the wilderness, it was training. Moses was being trained in the wilderness for how God was going to use him in the future. All right. Okay. So let's look at the people of Israel. Let's look at the people of Israel. And, we already touched on it a little bit. And this is more in Exodus, right? And we know Moses is leading the people of Israel through the wilderness. Now, again, when we look at the people of Israel, they were enslaved, like I mentioned, enslaved in captivity in Egypt. And, as we understand, this was something that was already foretold by God. And he actually told this to Abraham way back in Genesis. He basically told him that they would be enslaved, and he told him how long they would be enslaved. And then he said there would be a cry out for my people, and then I would send a deliverer to deliver them. And so God's word did, it's true. So what he said was going to happen was happened, and here we were. So, but in this case, for the people of Israel, their time in the wilderness was not for the same reason that Moses had to spend his time in the wilderness. They were not being trained for the call. They were in the wilderness for a different reason. They were being set apart, right? So they were in captivity. They were in bondage. They had been in slavery. And so they were accustomed to living a certain way. So as I mentioned before, when Moses came out and he encountered his people, he saw that they were basically living a life based on how they had been treated, right? So the Egyptians, however the Egyptians encountered them, however they were treated by, Pharaoh and his people, is how they really treated one another. And so now, whatever ways that they took on in Egypt, what God had for them before he placed them in the promised land, he's like, listen, that's not going to work. The ways that you were used to, the life that you were used to, what you relied on in the past to survive, what you relied on in the past to live, those strategies, that's not going to work, right? So you were used to doing things in a very humanistic way, right? And so those humanistic ways has a lot of shortfalls. And so God is going to reveal the shortfalls of human strategy in the wilderness, especially for the Israelites. He's going to reveal the shortfalls of human strategy in the wilderness. And so the Israelites, when he takes them, led by their deliverer, led by their shepherd into the wilderness, they are set apart, pulled away from Egypt, everything that they have become, kind of familiar with, and they are leaving those ways behind. They are being challenged to leave those ways behind and learn new things. Now, part of what they must learn, main thing that they need to learn is it's an identity thing. And there's so much wrapped up in identity in their wilderness journey. Identity in multiple parts. One, the identity of God, who God is to them and who they are to God. And so, God's like, you're my people, I'm your God. And so he wants them to understand the dynamics of this, identity and this relationship. And so they have to understand, to come to know this, and then to come to understand what it means for them before they can actually cross over into what God has promised them. So they all know that God has promised them something and they want it, but they have to be properly positioned to receive it. And in properly positioned to receive it, they have to learn how to truly depend on God. Now, one thing that we see in their journey, which was supposed to be a very short journey, right? It's supposed to be a short journey, but it turns out to be about 40 years for the Israelites. And part of the challenge here is the continuous struggle for Israel in the wilderness, because they basically keep going back to what they were familiar with, right? They had a leader they witnessed signs and wonders. They witnessed, God showed up in various ways for them to keep proving that he was their God, that he would never leave them, he would never forsake them, that he would provide for them. He would show them how to live with them. He would teach them lessons. He would help them to learn to hear him, recognize his voice, recognize who he was, how to see when he moves, how he moves, all of these things, right? All of these things about the nature of God, But yet, no matter what happened, they still tended to revert back to the ways of Egypt. It's like they always went back to old habits and old ways. And so, it's like when we talk about signs and wonders, God would do great and magnificent things, and they would ooh and ah and be grateful and thankful. But that would last as long as the taste was good, as long as the emotions were good, right? So as long as it feels good, as long as it tastes good, it's good. But then when the taste is gone and the emotions are gone, it's not good, because now we're like, okay, you left us. And then if Moses is not there, then he left us. And then we just go back to complaining because nothing's working out. And, are you really God? Is Moses really my leader? And so it's not working. So I'm just going to go back to everything else I knew, because at least I could depend on that. So I could depend on what I learned in Egypt. I could depend on the old, the other gods. And so I could just go back to idolatry. And so this just was the continuous cycle that the Israelites lived in, which is why it took them a long time to get through the wilderness, right? And this is kind of like how we live today, right? We have a challenge with trusting, this continued struggle with trusting God, understanding who he is in our life, understanding who we are to him. And so things are good based off of what God does for us and not who God is to us. And so whenever God does something, we're excited. And then when we don't see something happen, then it kind of fizzles out, right? Because we're not understanding the identity of God. We're not understanding who God is to us, and then also who we are to God. And so not understanding the dynamics of the relationship, it causes us to kind of faint away. It causes to keep letting go of his hand and then turning back to old things we're familiar with, like the horoscopes and the tarot readings, the psychics and the sage, and all that kind of stuff, right? Relying on our own will, our own understanding, and all that fun stuff. So we go back to what's familiar, and so we have a hard time staying on the firm foundation, which is the Word of God. And so, like I said, this wilderness period that we are very familiar with, which is why we kind of use this one so much, is that we're constantly cycling through this one, which is, we're stuck here, right? Like that old song that keeps playing on the radio over and over and over, that we keep looping. We're stuck here more often than not, trying to understand the identity of God, our identity in God, and then forming that relationship, and then continuously building on that relationship without taking those seven steps back and picking up old idols. So this wilderness period is truly about identity, and it's a very complex identity. So identity and relationship, that we are God's people, right? That he wants us to know who he is. He wants us to have that relationship with him. And he wants us to be able to live with him and understand how really to live with him, so that he can love us and we can love him. because, you know, in living with him, there's so much more in store for us. This is where the blessings continuously flow, right? So when he promised the Israelites, you're going to go into the land of milk and honey. That's where the blessings continuously flow. But you have to be able to understand how to live with God so that the blessings can continuously flow. See? That's how that works. But if the blessings are not continuously flowing, that means we're still stuck on, our hands are full with idolatry. And so we haven't laid those idols down, much like the lessons that we're not quite learning from the life of the Israelites. All right. So again, this time period in the wilderness that we are overly familiar with is learning to depend on God, learning our identity in God, learning the identity of God, the nature of God, who God is, who God is to us, who we are to God, and again, understanding that there are so many flaws in our humanistic strategies, and we need to learn, like I said, to depend on God. All right. One other thing in here is that, you know, we talk about our trust and faith when it comes to, you know, trusting God. And I know sometimes we're like, well, we need to just have, you know, faith but I have faith, but I only need faith of a mustard seed. And that's why we stay stagnant, because we're like, oh, we're doing things in our own time, and I just need faith of the mustard seed. And it's like, okay, that does work, that you need faith the size of a mustard seed in order for you to keep stepping out and trusting God, right? Learning who he is. But here's the thing about faith as we're going through this wilderness journey, because, you know, we can't keep asking God to keep proving who he is. He keeps showing up and proving it over and over and over again. At some point, we have to stop trying to force God to prove who he is. And then we just have to start taking this step of faith. And we have to start saying, well, you know what? You keep showing up. You've shown me time and time again, because that's what he told the Israelites too, right? He's like, listen, remember that I brought you out of Egypt. Remember that I brought you through the wilderness. Remember that I delivered you out of the hands of your enemy. Remember. And a lot of times we're just not remembering. And what we do is we say, but, you know, I just need faith the size of a mustard seed. The seed is only as good as as much as you're going to nurture the seed. Because if you are not taking that seed and planting the seed, putting it in the ground, nurturing it so that it can grow, it ain't doing you no good. You can't eat from that seed. And after a while, even a seed will lose its ability to germinate. It will dry up and it'll die. That seed will eventually dry up and die if it's not planted, if it's not used, if it's not preserved, right? So you still have to do something with a seed. So you can't just hold on to a seed forever and expect this to live off a seed forever. You have to plant the seed. You have to nurture the seed and allow the seed to grow so that you can have some fruit. And I kind of shared things about learning how to understanding the planting and the harvesting season. It's the same thing. You have to do something with the seed. So the seed, the faith the size of a mustard seed only works if you're going to nurture that, which means that you plant it and then you keep nurturing that seed of faith and watching that your faith continuously grow. And we're not you know, it may grow initially and you saw that God did something, but after a while you should start having more faith in who God is versus what God does, right? That's shifting the maturity of your faith. All right, I'm gonna get off of that one. So let's shift a little bit, and since we're talking about faith, and we're gonna shift over to my guy Elijah. I love Elijah. And we're going to look at Elijah's time in the wilderness. We're going to look at Elijah's time in the wilderness. This is going to be, we're going to focus a little bit in First Kings 19. First Kings 19 is kind of where we're focusing on Elijah's time in the wilderness. All right. So where we're picking up on Elijah is after he has the encounter, and he slays the prophets of Baal. After he has the encounter and he slays the prophets of Baal, and he slays them all, they're gone. And now Jezebel is out for blood, right? So the battle is over. Elijah slayed all the prophets of Baal, and Jezebel is livid. She's livid. She out for blood. And she's ready to kill Elijah, right? And so Elijah, afraid for his life, flees. He flees. And so he goes on like a day's journey. He's in the wilderness. He's on a day's journey, and he finds himself under the juniper tree. Not alone, but a lone juniper tree. Finds himself under a lone juniper tree, right? And he sits there and he tells God, like just take me, right? He's like, he basically asked to die. And then he goes to sleep. So an angel appears, the angel of the Lord appears, and he touches Elijah. And he says, wake, eat. And Elijah opens his eyes. He sees cakes on coals and water. Elijah eats, and he goes back to sleep. He rests. Elijah opens his eyes again. He sees cakes on coals and water. He eats, and he rests. Goes to sleep. Then the angel appears a second time. He touches Elijah, and he says, you need to eat. The journey before you is too long, and it's too much for you. You need to eat. And so Elijah opens his eyes. He sees the cakes on coals and the water, and he eats again. And this time the food sustains him, and so he is able to take this 40-day journey in the wilderness, and he finds himself, and he journeys out to Mount Horeb. And so he goes out, goes there, and he goes there, and he's goes into the cave. So he's there, and then the word of the Lord comes to Elijah and says, like, what are you doing here? Why are you here? And Elijah says, yeah, so I'm jealous for the Lord. So in other words, he complains. He puts his petition in. He puts his petition in. And he says, I'm jealous for the Lord. He said, basically, like the Israelites, he says the Israelites, they've forsaken you. They've forsaken your covenants. They've torn down your altars. They've killed all your prophets. And here am I, alone. And now they're after me. You're gonna kill me. They're looking for me, and they want to take my life. And and so he's told, go go out on the mount and talk to the Lord. Meet the Lord there. And so he goes out, he meets the Lord. All right. Sorry, phone's ringing. All right, so he goes out and he's told to go out to the mount and talk to the Lord. Now, this is important to understand because this is a place where God revealed his glory, right? This is where God revealed his glory. And this whole setup about Elijah even going out here to begin with, there's been a lot of questions, a lot of controversy about why Elijah even went out here, right? So, he's fearful. He's afraid for his life. He told the Lord to take his life. What's happening with Elijah, right? So we want to back up and kind of bring some context to this instead of just telling the story, right? So let's kind of help. Well, Elijah at this point is just like, he's feeling hopeless. He's feeling like there's no point in what he's doing. He is God's prophet. He is God's man who God has sent to bring reformation, right? To reform the Israelites during a time when they are in full idolatry. They are serving everybody but God, everything but God, doing everything. I mean, they're in apostasy. So that's why he says, they've broken your covenant. They've torn down your altars. Everyone that you have sent, every prophet you have sent to give them a word, they killed them. They literally killed them with the sword. Right? So they're killing your mouthpiece. They're killing your men of God. So there's nowhere for me to go. There is no one here to help me. I'm just out here. And so Elijah's feeling like, well, I'd rather just die in isolation than to keep going on a fruitless mission. I'd rather die in isolation than to die on a fruitless mission. And he's just lost hope. It's like he feels like God has him just out there and nothing is happening. That no matter what he does, the people are not being reformed. And that no matter what God has him say, no matter what God has him do, there has been no change in the people. And he's even pled to God at one point, like, you're not placing judgment on them at a time where he thought, there should have been judgment. And God's like, in other words, God's like, let me be God. I got this, right? You need to have faith in my plan. And Elijah's like, nothing's working. Like, what are we doing? So he has no faith. And so this place that he goes to, this is a place where God has in the past revealed himself. He's revealed his glory. I mean, this is where he met Moses, right? He's met Moses here before. And so, the thought where a lot of scholars believe that this is why Elijah kind of went out here. So where we looked at previously, Moses was out in the wilderness, and you look at Israel, Moses was in the wilderness, and this was his period of training, and Israel was in Israel in the wilderness, and this was their period of getting to know who God was, right? For them as they're moving into, how to live with God, right? This is a time frame where Elijah is like, I need God. So God didn't send him to the wilderness. Elijah went into the wilderness because he needed God. He took himself into isolation because it was either do or die. Like, I don't even want to do this anymore. God, I'm your person. You sent me. I'm working for you. but I'm at a point to where I have nothing. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to do it. And I don't think I want to do this anymore. So he's given up all hope. So where the wilderness is a place where, we see God sends people to be set apart, to spend time with him. We see Elijah actually set himself apart, go into isolation, and it is believed that he is going into isolation to be with God, going into isolation to find God in hopes of finding God. Because even though it seems like he has lost faith, he is feeling depleted. Perhaps there is still some hope in God. You'll hear me, you'll hear my cry, because he didn't stop talking to God. So there is some hope. So that is the scholarly belief that is there. And so you can look at different studies and commentaries and theological commentaries and things like that, and you'll see that quite a bit, that is a lot of the argument that is happening there. And so being a scholar myself, that's kind of like how I honestly, that's what I kind of see it that way too in this instance, especially in this instance, right? As we're kind of really examining this wilderness period. So we're looking at it from that point of, when you are at a point to where you're at your low, are you going into the wilderness to find God for yourself so that you can, you want him to show up, because you don't know what to do. And in this case, this is what we see, right? God does show up, right? So we see the angel of the Lord show up and then, ask him why he's there. And then the word of the Lord comes and says, we'll go out there and talk to him. And then the Lord comes. The Lord comes. We see, the wind and the earthquake and the fire, and in all these things that happen, the voice of the Lord is not there. The way the voice of the Lord comes is through the small still voice. The small still voice. And this is so important because we see this small still voice when we look in the New Testament, and we see how we see the Holy Spirit, right? The Holy Spirit comes, and so that's that small still voice. When we are introduced to the Holy Spirit in the New Testament, it's the same way. It's the small still voice, right? And so we are actually introduced to this in the Old Testament, and especially here when we look at Elijah. And so we see how Elijah responds to the Lord coming, and how the Lord passed by through the great and strong wind that rent the mountains and broke into pieces the rock before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a small still voice. And that's how he showed up, in the small still voice. And then that is when Elijah hid his face in his mantle. And so, we understand that there is a fear of the Lord, but this is where we understand that in this instance, the fear of the Lord is not afraid. The fear of the Lord is in reverence. The fear of the Lord here is called in reverence and honor. And so it's like, the glory is too much, right? So I'm not supposed to look at the Lord. So it's in reverence, it's in honor. And that is what he does. He hides his face in honor. And not to mention the fact that, he's, he was tapping out. So he's like, oh, I'm kind of hiding my face. But when we see this here and we hear the Lord speak, we see how the Lord actually deals with Elijah. And it's so interesting that the Lord comes and he encourages. He actually comes and encourages. And he helps to restore Elijah's faith. and he helps him to move, to continue to move, to continue to move on in his mission. Where, Elijah once wanted to give up, because he even asked Elijah, like, what are you doing here? He asked him the same question. What are you doing here? And Elijah tells us the same thing, right? There's great apostasy. That, like, this is a fruitless mission. Nothing's happening. Everything you're trying to do, like, it's all happening, but the people are still just, they're running amok. Like they're just out of control, right? Like they just doing whatever they want to do. So, like, what do we do? And now they want to kill me. They didn't kill everybody else you sent, and now they trying to kill me too. So I just want to sit here and die in isolation, because it doesn't make sense for me to keep going out here and let them kill me. I could just sit here and die, right? And so Elijah's like, is there no one else? Like, I'm out here by myself. There has to be something. And so the Lord encourages him, because the Lord wants him to continue to move on. He doesn't want him to quit. He wants him to continue to move on. And he lets him know, like, listen, if I have you out here, then you're never alone. You're never alone. You have to trust my plan. You have to trust me, right? You're not by yourself, right? And so he encourages him to move. He encourages him, as only God can, to continue on his mission. And he tells him, he gives him even instructions for when he goes back, on his way back to the wilderness of Damascus. And he tells him when he goes back, when you get there, make sure that he wants him to anoint Hazael over Syria. He wants him to anoint Jehu as king over Israel. And then he also wants him to anoint Elisha as his successor, as prophet. So, which means, like, you're not out here by yourself. There's a plan. There's a plan. It's going to continue. And so he's encouraged. He's encouraged. And he's encouraged through that small, still voice when God shows up. That's amazing. So it's so different than the other two encounters that we just talked about, right? And so, whereas the other two are kind of somewhat driven, right? They're driven into the wilderness. Elijah takes himself into isolation so that he can spend time with God, because he needs that encouragement. And he's hoping that God is going to show up, because he has set himself apart so that he can hear God, so that he can be with God, so that he can find God and God can find him. So he's hoping that in this time of isolation, in this time of being in the wilderness, that he will find God. Wow. So everybody's wilderness is not the same. I mean, if we look at these three alone, I mean, can you find yourself in any one of these periods of isolation? Which one resonates with you? We still have like 3 more to go through, which is crazy, right? But we normally say, like, hey, I feel like I'm just in a period of ice. I'm in a wilderness. I feel like I'm in a wilderness. But where in the wilderness are you? Are you like, Moses? Are you in training in the wilderness? Or are you, like the Israelites? Are you out here, trying to figure out who God is for you? Is that your wilderness period? Or have you actually been out working and now, so much is happening to where you're losing hope, you're losing faith, and you put yourself in a timeout so that you can sit with God and figure out what the heck is going on and what should you do, and God, what's the plan? And you need new strategy, like trying to figure it out. You just need some hope, some encouragement, and you're just spending time with God to be set apart so that you can get what you need. What? Like, it's just so good, right? Listen, we have like 3 more people we need to go through, right? We need to look at the wilderness period with Christ. We still need to look at the wilderness period with David, and the wilderness period with the Apostle Paul. So, and we're actually going to go through David, Jesus, and the Apostle Paul. David, Jesus, and Apostle Paul. But we're going to stop here for now. And we're going to come back. Hopefully, you're going to come back to get the rest of it, right? Because we really want to keep looking at these periods of wilderness and what we get out of each period of wilderness. Because I think that, you go through wilderness periods, and sometimes, you might be going through a Moses period more than once, depending on what God is calling you to do. You might go through an Elijah period more than once, right? So whatever wilderness period you go through, you might encounter that more than once. But again, like I said, we're not done. We still have to look at David, Jesus, and the Apostle Paul. So join me next time as we continue on looking at the seasons of wilderness, and how it relates to our journey as we are getting to know God. See you next time.